Excuse me, let me start over again. We're so pleased that you could be with us for this, I think I could say historic occasion, the coming together of some of the most important architects who practiced here in the Los Angeles area during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and we're especially grateful that you could stay for today and spend some time here at school. And I thought we'd take advantage of this time to talk a little bit about your background. I think it would be of interest if you would care to share some of your recollections of your beginnings in architecture. We would be very interested to hear about it today.
Well, this has been a lot of fun for me so far because it's a chance to relive in memory many things that I enjoyed very much, and it's compressing a good many things and a good many years into a short time. And as a native Californian, I'm enjoying the distinction, which is, I don't know that it is as much a distinction now as it was when I was very young, because everyone here was an immigrant then, but there's been so much immigration and birth since then that it's not quite the same distinction. But it's this California of the late 19th century and early 20th century in which I grew up that I have found to be the feature of my work insofar as it perhaps can be distinguished from that of other modernists. I'm not only a native, but both of my parents were natives too. And
wasn't your father an architect?
And my father was an architect.
So you're a second-generation architect as well.
And it was the influence through houses like those of Green and Green, and there may have been some actual Green and Green houses that were a part of my childhood. I never thought of it as architecture, but later on I realized that what was appealing to me in them and in Frank Lloyd Wright and others was really what had been the atmosphere of the time. It was not only the buildings, but the thought that was behind the buildings of that time. And so their buildings are something that are almost symbols to me of it, as much as the orange groves and the eucalyptus trees and the palms and the snow-capped peaks and the poinsettias and the blossoms and the ocean and the desert and all the rest of it, and seeing such a building is just like seeing the American flag on the other side of the world, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, it must have been a very exciting period to have grown up in.
Well, perhaps it wasn't architecturally exciting, but it was distinct in this, that something that doesn't seem as though it should be so rare, that is this confluence of a benign nature, a free society, and a belief in progress and of the capacity of man to create a paradise on earth. This kind of idealism, however unfounded it may be in later fact, I think was responsible for the character of much that we did then, and which I don't believe is completely gone forever. but it was something very distinctive, and as I say, it's hard to think that it could happen so seldom, if ever before, in the history of the world, that these things should come together as they did here. But they did, and if we had been able to avoid World War I and World War II and these other things that could have gone on developing or not, I don't know. But World War I certainly marked the end of it.
Your education was here as well?
Yes. I went to Pomona College. I went to Otis Art Institute, now I think the Los Angeles County Institute or School of Art, and Frank Wigan's Trade School, where I got my engineering, and then work on projects with Richard Neutra beginning in 1927, and association with others like Gregory Ain, who also was attracted to Neutra.
How did you meet Mr. Neutra?
I saw a building under construction. It was unlike anything that I'd ever seen before, except in some photographs in a German architectural magazine, and I discovered the name of the architect, and I was told his name was Schindler, and I looked him up in the telephone book, got the address, and without telephoning, proceeded to go and call on him, which was an astonishing thing for anyone as timid as I was to do. And it turned out that Mr. Schindler was only two architects. The other architect was Richard Neutra, who had followed Mr. Schindler to America from Vienna, only coming about 1923 or 4, I guess, rather than in 1914 when Mr. Schindler did. And it was Mr. Schindler's own house in which I visited him, his house and office, that opened my eyes to what architecture could be. I was a sculpture student at the time, and I had only discovered architecture as art a few months before when I saw Frank Lloyd Wright's Barnstable house called the Hollyhock House.
And that was a meaningful moment in your life?
And that was the first time I had ever heard Mr. Wright's name. I knew nothing about him. This was 1925, I guess. And so this was what turned me toward architecture. And I was turned not only by Mr. Wright's buildings and then what I read about him and by him, but also by Louis Sullivan, not by anything that he had done, because I didn't see that even in photographs, but by his own story of architecture as told through his autobiography of an idea.
Yes.
This was my beginning of interest, and I think I was very fortunate in the fact that Mr. Neutra was here, was interested in having persons like Gregory Ain and me to work on projects with him, because there were no actual buildings to be built. I did work for less than a week on the Lowe House, which Mr. Neutra was then finishing drawings for, and that was the last thing until way along in the middle 30s.
We sometimes forget the dearth of work that existed in those years, and so that the things that you mostly were working on were competitions and projects, that kind of thing?
Yes. Several of us got Mr. Neutra to act as a critic, I suppose one would say, in the School of Architecture, but critic is completely the wrong word to say, because we were collaborators, and that was the word that he used. And at first we each took a project, a program, and then proceeded to develop it with his criticism. However, after the very first one, we undertook a collaborative effort, which was the design of an airport, an entry in the Lehigh-Portland Cement Airport competition in 1929. And that then was followed by collaborative work on projects for the International Congresses for Modern Architecture. And this was a way in which we could compare our work with the work of others like Gropius, Mies, and Aud that was being done at exactly the same time. But there was a great, great difference between our work and their work. And they were Europeans and we were Americans, and although Neutra spoke with a very foreign accent, and the look of his buildings was completely different from that either of the native Californian that was here, as represented by Green and Green, Maybeck, and others of that kind. Irving Gill. Well, Gill looked a bit more European, but only in a very superficial way. And it was really in the superficial ways that Neutra and Schindler's work was really different. They were really American, and both of them were here because they were attracted to America by something in it that they were looking for. They weren't driven here. They didn't come here to escape the persecution. They came here to realize more fully themselves, which they could here, not merely in a new freedom, but with some positive ideas that were capable of development, and in an atmosphere, in a climate, in a country that encouraged that kind of growth. And this made a difference that distinguishes the modern work here from the East Coast, where there was no native development. There was only an import there. Even the very earliest, before the Georgian, was an import, and certainly the Georgian was, and nothing had followed it, and it resisted all efforts to develop something original and native.
They were more involved with the classical tradition at that time, were they not?
Yes, and so it wasn't until the men like Gropius and Breuer and others who came in at the very end of the 30s when they were escaping Nazi persecution and brought more or less intact the modern of Europe here, that the East finally capitulated, and it capitulated fully. That is, it capitulated to the entire design, the entire idea, and so it was European fundamentally, and it's taken quite a long while to escape that. What I'm trying to say is, in all of these words, that there was a native growth here which had somewhat stagnated, had become overgrown with other growths between the end of World War I, or the beginning of World War I practically, and the time of Schindler and Neutra's advent here, which was in the early 20s. And so it was a matter of clearing out that undergrowth and being stimulated by the new thought from Europe, which developed on the earlier native growth.
Do you feel that those years with working with Mr. Neutra and collaborating with Mr. Neutra had a strong impact on your
Well, there's no question of that, although my first interest in architecture was Mr. Wright, Mr. Wright's work. Mr. Neutra was here, and although Mr. Neutra represented something quite different from Mr. Wright, it wasn't antithetical to it. And it was alive and new, and I had no difficulty in throwing myself wholly into it. I didn't hold off protecting my love of Mr. Wright in order to do this. I could easily wait until there was an opportunity to use what I had discovered in Mr. Wright in ways more like him. I found that they were not exclusive in any way, and as I have said earlier, however foreign Mr. Neutra and Mr. Schindler were in some ways, in other ways they were extremely American, and I think they did a great deal to develop a modern residential approach here that of course spread to the whole country, as the earlier purely native thing of green and green and Maybeck spread. One can find, as I was interested to do, in almost any city in the United States, north, south, east, or west, somewhere, the California bungalow, unless it happened that there had been a fire, a flood, or some such catastrophe to wipe them out, or there had been a depression on in that part of the country at that particular time, and so there was no building at all. It was a widespread thing, but not wide enough to establish itself and continue without other support.
How did you interrelate with Gregory Ain in those years?
Well, Neutra was the pole that brought us together. Our collaboration with him, in which his thought was something that we were supporting together, eliminated any suggestion of competition between Greg and me. And although we have developed somewhat differently in the years since we were together with Neutra, it was a very fruitful association in those years. Of course, we had the feeling that we were drawn together by the fact that we were in what could be considered an alien world as far as architecture went. That is, as far as both the profession and also the potential clientele that at that moment was completely absorbed in the Spanish and Mediterranean rage, which had come in after the 1915-16 fair in San Diego, where the work of Bertram Goodhue, which was done very, very beautifully and naturally aroused a great deal of interest in Spanish work. Mm-hmm. However, it had a bad effect on the development of the native architecture.
Yes, that's what I've always felt. If Irving Gill had been given opportunity to take charge of that fair, perhaps the modern, the evolution of modern design might have been furthered through those years.
You're entirely right in my estimation.
When you left Mr. Neutra, did you have opportunities then to start working on your own?
I don't know why. I don't believe it was a case of leaving Mr. Neutra. I don't know what happened, but anyway, Mr. Neutra went away This is, I suppose, the explanation. There was no work to be done here. The Lowe House had been finished, had been well photographed. There was an opportunity for him to return on a lecture trip to Europe.
This was the year he spent abroad.
Yes, and we had been working together until that time. While he was gone, I worked on some projects, and so did Greg. We saw a good deal of one another. And then, since I couldn't find a job in an office anyplace, I looked for a client. And I found a client, and as happens with most beginning architects, I think, it's always a friend. Usually a friend who's going to get married, or there's some other special occasion that calls for a house. And that was the case with me at this time. And of course I had a great deal of time to spend in developing this, and since it was my first real house, I had to put everything that I knew, thought, or felt, or that I believed I ever would think or feel into this one thing. And it was very small, but it didn't look like Mr. Neutra's work very much. The earlier designs for it made it look much more like a Neutra or a Schindler design because it had a flat roof. It had prefabricated panel walls of a lightweight concrete. But I've forgotten the name now of the Pasadena Building and Loan Company that we were indebted to for money with which to build it. And so immediately it changed from a flat roof to a pitched roof. It was a wood shingle.
That was their requirement.
That's right. Of course, we could have used a clay tile roof on it, all right, but we couldn't afford that. And the walls changed to board and batten. And it was a very nice house. And I suppose it was the fact that the loan company insisted upon this change that nearly all of my work after that has been with pitched roofs. It wasn't a choice to begin with, and I have used flat roofs even on houses quite a number of times since. But this initial beginning was due to that pressure.
What was the name of your client on this initial venture?
Pauline Lowe. Actually, it was her husband who was my friend, and his name was Clive Delbridge. They were later separated, and the house was always published in her name. It's in Pasadena, in Altadena. As soon as it was done, I rushed in with borrowed furniture and floor coverings and other things, and covered the unpaved earth in the bedroom gardens with some mats to get photographs and enter it in the competition. It was a House Beautiful competition, and I won an honorable mention. And
First time out.
so this helped, and we went on from there.
And how did your practice develop? Mostly residential through
That was the case. Of course, most work at this time was residential. There wasn't much of it. There was nothing in the way of large business or institutional buildings, some very small commercial, but not much of that. And just looking at the entries in the General Electric competition of 1935, one sees names like that of Wallace K. Harrison and others. Harrison, by the way, was one of the architects of Rockefeller Center.
Yes.
He was also the architect of the United Nations building, of the New York, of the Metropolitan Opera House, and we could go on with other things. But he was entering a small house competition in his own name at that time, which tells you something about
the period. It was the 30s now that you're speaking
This
of.
was 1935 that I'm speaking of.
Are there any particular jobs that stick out in your mind that were especially satisfying to you?
it's always hard to answer a question which says, which is your favorite building? Because
well, I won't press you to that.
I know you don't. But I can describe perhaps the kind of building and the client and the cases in which the client and I saw eye to eye and developed something that was mine but had a great deal of the client in it, and where the harmony of our interests resulted in something that I am very pleased with. These are usually buildings that are extremely simple. It doesn't look as though anything much had gone into them, but because the problem was very simple. The building was simple too. But to make that problem simple was oftentimes a very laborious job, but nothing that I recall that was ever done with parts that I particularly liked just in themselves were ever in a building that I really liked later. When one looks over photographs or revisits a building later, it's these that were so extremely simple and looked as though they were no effort at all to do are the ones that are satisfying, and the others that exhibit the ambitions that one might have for the design are the ones that have the things that one wishes that he had not put in.
Were there some special goals and ideals that you were working with in those days?
Well, of course, the modernists, particularly the European modernists, were paying great attention to function. But their definition of function was a very narrow one, and there was also a desire to use a machine aesthetic. Now, some of this can be understood, I think, by realizing that the defeat of Germany, and Germany was really the seat of the modern European work, the defeat of Germany meant that Germany was turning itself very, not only resolutely, but almost viciously on its own past. And anything that suggested the past was discarded immediately. And the belief that its future was in the machine, and therefore they not only would use the machine to build their buildings, but they would glorify it in making their buildings look like machines, was very much a part of this. And this is something that we were completely free from here. Here, machinery was was a tool to help our living, whether it was with houses, automobiles, cities, or what it was. But it was the life that we wanted, not the machine, that was the important thing. And so we had a very different attitude. It was expressed best, I suppose, by Henry Ford in his motor car. An automobile was transportation. That was what it was for. It was what you could do with it that was important, not the fact that it didn't look like a horse or a buggy. And it was, too, Ford's idea as far as production went, interchangeable parts, standardization, all of this, which was very American, and this was a part of America that Neutra sensed before he ever came here, and came partly because it was the home of Henry Ford, partly because it was the home of Frank Lloyd Wright, and one doesn't think that Henry Ford and Frank Lloyd Wright are interchangeable by any means. So that that there was an aptitude in mechanical matters. There was a way of not only inventing machinery, but using machinery that was distinctively different from that was now appearing in Europe, that accounts for the difference between the architecture of the two places.
Did you have any interest in that aesthetic that had to do with the mass-produced, prefabricated
Yes,
building?
very much so. I must confess that my first interest in architecture was architecture as sculpture, because when I saw this building of Mr. Wright's, I was a sculpture student, and what I saw was the exterior of the building, and the fact that it looked like no other building that I had ever seen. Its parts were all completely different. I saw it in a completely fresh way. There were no associations with other buildings in what I saw of this. And I saw it as the most marvelous piece of sculpture and something that thrilled me. And it was only later that I began to discover all of the other qualities that were a part of it. And then I began to see that architectural design isn't visual design only, and it's something that you don't perceive simply with your eyes. It's something that you perceive with the muscles of your legs and the soles of your feet and every sense that you have, and that in architecture everything that can be used to guide and direct and move you through those various senses has to do with architecture, but that fundamentally the form is the form of a person's living, of his behavior, of his acting, and it's a form that is seen through the physical units of the building, but it isn't something that can be treated as a still life at all. This reminds me of one thing, and I'll try to make it very, very short. I remember in 1943, we were in New York City. We were living there for 2 years during the war, and I knew Siegfried Gideon because I had been back in 1931 to the secretary of the American group of the International Congresses for Modern Architecture. No one knew that I was not even an architect. But anyway, so...
That's the
Gideon,
CIAM Congress,
yes,
right?
And Gideon, who had been giving some lectures at Harvard, was caught here by the war and stayed here. Sert, who'd also come over to give lectures, was here. And so I saw quite a bit of Gideon and Sert, but the point I want to make is that during the summer, Gideon and a painter,
Clay?
no, an abstract painter, but he's here at the time. I remember later he and Man Ray together made a movie, an abstract movie. Well, anyway,
Kandinsky?
it wasn't Kandinsky. He wasn't here then. I know exactly what this man looked like, too. Well, anyway, to go on with the story.
Mondrian?
No, it wasn't. Mondrian was here, and I know that. And Sert moved into Mondrian's apartment when Mondrian died. But the two spent 6 weeks or so of the summer up in the northern part of New York State. They weren't supposed to go out of the country because they were aliens, but they did sneak over into Canada. But what they saw up here was farmland, and like much of America's farmland, you see it dotted with pieces of farm machinery that they haven't sometimes completely abandoned, rusted and falling down. And when they came back, Gideon showed me with great glee a collection of photographs they had made. And these were pieces of machinery in the landscape, but they had gone to the effort, in many cases, to prop them up in grotesque ways, to further take them apart and treat them as dismembered things. And this told me immediately the difference between the European view of machinery and the American view of machinery. The American idea was a machine is beautiful when its action is beautiful, when it's swift, silent, effective in all such ways. It's its action that is beautiful. And the European is afraid of machinery. And their great glee was seeing machinery dismembered, unable to act. It no longer could attack them in any way.
Sounds like it was affected by the William Morris
I'm sorry
idea.
Took me so long to say this.
No, but what you say about the European point of view sounds like an extension of William Morris's extreme reaction against industrialization in the machine and all of that.
Yes, of course, what he feared, I think, was not the direct action of the machine. What he feared was the influence of mass production and lowered standards of taste to meet the lowest common denominator of taste, which mass production seems to demand in order to make it a going business proposition.
Was the idea of prefabrication a European idea? Did that come from the European
I don't
architects?
think that it is. One probably can find some examples, but it was here that it was seen as something that had a wide use and something that could remodel, could change the whole course of our development. It was more than mere Yankee ingenuity. It was something that would make production much more plentiful, prices lower, and that it had a flexibility that the older forms, which were rigid, did not have. I'm not saying this very well.
No, that's fine. I'm still curious as to how these ideas touched you in your architecture.
Well, I suppose that I saw this in a very different way when I saw it through the eyes of Neutra. The materials for design were materials that had not been used enough before for any architectural form to have been arrived at in any fullness at all. And it's like anything else new that you find as a new resource, and that is also a suggestion of a direction or a form that might be taken. It's something that you feel can be developed, or that added to what you have, it will develop into something further and newer. And so as a new resource, and of course the fact that you have something that no one else has had so far, it seems, makes it exciting to do. You don't know how far it's going to lead, where it's going to go, and it's the prospect of a development that no one can see the end of right now that makes it interesting.
Do you feel that it touched you in any particular project? Did you have those kinds of concepts consciously working?
Well, naturally, as I said, in my very first building for a client, the first thing that was entirely my own, all of these things that I was conscious of at the time were there. It was a building that was developed out of identical units in which wall panels, window panels, door panels, partition panels, cabinets, roof and floor panels were all congruent with one another in the design. They could be put together, they could be interchanged. One could switch from one to the other. And
did that bring down the price of production?
Well,
or construction,
would
I should
have
say?
If we had been set up, prepared for this sort of thing. First of all, in the manufacture, then in the financing system that would take this into account, and with designs that had a character that enabled them to be used in a great variety of ways, something that could be used in one building or another just as easily as a standard-sized brick could be used in one building or another.
But as your work developed, it didn't play so much of a key role.
Well, I think it did, even though the actual manufacture of the building didn't utilize this feature, particularly the dimensioning and the shaping of it, and most important of all, probably, was the rhythmical composition of the building using these elements. It was as though a musician had never had a scale to work with before. We had a scale that was just as exciting as any musical scale would be to a person, more so, I imagine, than the 12-tone scale was to Arnold Schoenberg when he... Anyway, the whole rhythmical development of my work, and that's been a strong feature of it, sometimes very subdued and sometimes made very loud and clear. Anyway, it's something that developed out of designing for a system which seldom influenced the manufacture of the house, but it certainly influenced the design of it in other ways.
So from the years about 1934, 1951, you practiced here, mostly in Southern California?
Except for the 2 years,
2 years in New York.
2 war years in New York.
And then in 51, you left our fair state?
In 51, we were into the Korean War, and the World War II was so close behind us. And World War I, which had put my father out of business for a while, the memory of his experience in World War I, my experience in World War II, and the uncertainty whether the Korean War was going to be a 4-year or longer war caused me to accept an invitation from University of Texas to go there as a director of the School of Architecture, and so that was why I left California.
Mm-hmm. Was that a satisfying experience at Austin?
Somewhat. At least it was better than being in the trenches or flying over enemy lines. I enjoyed it, but my greatest joy was in designing buildings, and buildings that would be built, not simply student projects.
Were you able to continue your practice coincidentally through that period as you led the program?
In a very limited way, and when I left the university after 4 years, I had some projects jobs, commissions, waiting me, and they were in Texas, and so that was why I stayed in Texas. And then 10 years, 6 years after that, 10 years after I had left California, Henry Kappe asked me for the third time to come to the School of Design, University in North Carolina, State College it was then called, now State University, and thinking that I could carry on a private practice and do some teaching without any of the responsibilities of administration, led me to accept that. And so I have been there since, and I taught full-time for about 8 years, and then part-time for 3 years, and then I retired completely, and I've been designing since then some houses and a number of churches, and going back over earlier work, sometimes for a talk such as we're having here now, and also for some exhibitions, and also in preparation for an exhibition and book on the work. So I've been reliving the past as well as trying to continue it on into the future.
The work that you did in Texas and now in Raleigh, how do you compare it with your earlier work?
Well, the earlier work was smaller in size and infinitely smaller in cost, and for clients, for the most part, that knew they couldn't afford luxuries of any kind. The only luxury they could afford was good design, and that didn't cost much. It didn't cost nearly as much as a refrigerator or an air conditioning system or something of that sort. And as I look at these earlier designs and see how extremely simple they were, and the simplicity was not due really to any scarcity of any sort. It was due to the uncomplicated demands that were made on me. And so the houses were smaller, they were simpler than the later ones. Climate made some difference in the houses in California and Texas, not a great deal. And I don't know what it would have made still a greater difference. I feel there's a great deal of continuity fundamentally between the houses. Certainly my feeling is the same, only more intense perhaps than earlier, and perhaps also I see the design in terms of more senses of a greater number of elements that need to be harmonized in the pattern which forms the living pattern, working pattern, which forms the basis then of the structural pattern of the building, and of course the contributing patterns that complete it and which reinforce one another. It's this absorption into one overall pattern of the minor patterns of so that an overall pattern that comprehends them all is really the architectural pattern, the architectural design. And I'm certainly more conscious of how this comes about now than I was earlier. And I think these things can be carried further and they can be made richer than they were before. And perhaps more and more I start with the human elements than I did earlier, because I feel more confident that with them the means will be found to develop this. And so perhaps that's the difference.
Also, I wonder how you feel about the change in material. Some of your outstanding projects here used a lot of beautiful wood detailing, such as the Havens House. And I feel, as I look through the little publication that you've given us, that the later work is more stucco. Is that correct?
Well,
is it more sculptural?
Not so much.
Do you feel it's more of a sculptural expression?
Some are stucco, some quite a number are brick, some are concrete block, and others. And this is partly due to place, but it's also partly due to changes in building costs. As I mentioned earlier, the first change was in the first house, where it changed from stucco, from prefabricated concrete panels to wood. And changing to wood, I began then to think of how one can make use of the fact that wood, particularly as we had it then in its natural form and not in veneer and laminated forms, but as something of a limited length and width, something that was straight. It wasn't something that would be bent. In any large structure, the structure had to be made up of many, many pieces, and that we were working with a material that didn't fuse into one thing when we put it together. They remained distinct, and as the weather worked on them, they became still more distinct, and that these widths and lengths had to become a feature of the design. So as they opened further, and as they twisted, and as one changed color a little different from the neighbor, the design wasn't destroyed by this. Continuity had to be made up of a succession of things, most easily a succession of equal-sized or spaced things that became not a solid line but a broken line, and that these were elements to produce a further rhythm, a superficial rhythm, as well as the rhythm that had been made by those things that determined the real structure of the building. So that one just thinks in different terms when he thinks in terms of wood. Now that's not so very different from what it would be with steel, at least not so different from what it would be with steel, where one's still putting it together with rivets and not welding it. Welding makes a change there, but we're still dealing with sticks and slabs, whether they are of steel or wood, whether they're shingle or plywood or what. And one is inclined to develop these features, these divisions, to group them into larger elements, and to get in the pattern within an element and between elements a rhythmic thing, a very musical thing, really. And so one enjoys then using it that way. Now with another material, with stucco, with plaster, it's the fact that you have a skin that you can carry over a surface, around the corner, over the top, under it and around. It's the continuity of unbroken surface that you like to play up. It has a very, very different effect. But this is something then that you naturally look for there, and you enjoy it when you can follow this out quite fully. And so these materials make a difference, but I can use one just as joyfully as another.
How do you feel about the work that's going on today? You mentioned skinning. There's a lot of that kind of concept going on, especially in some of our large work here in Los Angeles. How do you relate to the architecture that's being done today? How do you react and feel about it?
Well, the largeness of the scale makes it very difficult to not make great mistakes. When the mistakes that you may make are comparatively small and can be corrected or smoothed out or minimized by further work, I'm much bolder to do it and much more ready to welcome differences, feeling certain that the mistakes that may occur are not irreparable. But when things become enormous, as they are apt to, particularly in planning projects, mega structures of any kind, and where the factors that involved are so many and so varied and so beyond the capacity of almost anyone to fully realize, a decision to commit acres and miles and millions of tons, it seems, of things to this one thing is the thing that makes me pause.
You've devoted almost 50 years of creative energy to the architectural profession and to your practice. Can we close with some of your feelings about architecture, about what it's been to you, how you felt through the years with the architecture that you've produced?
I don't know whether I can say that in a short time or not. I can go on talking for a long time trying to put that in terms that even I would understand, much less another person. But architecture to me, from the beginning, has been primarily a means of discovery of myself. Not that I don't know who I am. I don't have any feeling of mistaken or lost identity of any kind. But to realize more fully what the universe is, can be, and how it can be more fully itself developing in a harmonious way, and so that when I discovered a building that was alive, and live as an expression of something real, fundamental, and that I felt.
Could you repeat that
of.
phrase, when you discover a building? I'm sorry.
And this, of course, was, as I was telling you the other night, a building that I had not expected to have any great admiration for, because I didn't think there were any buildings that one could have admiration for. The less building, the less a building tried to be art, the better it was. That architecture was too impure to be an art of any kind. And I was convinced in one look that if this were a building, it was unlike any other building that I had ever seen or ever thought of before. And